right, I have the top of the hour. I am attempting to share my desktop. I pray that you guys can see and hear me. I am Terrance Walker with InterRel Consulting Partners, here with the incomparable Veronica Tafoya. She's Veronica to some, but she'll always be Veronica to me. Here to present in our 2021 Consolidations track in our Hyperion Solutions Conference, customized financial consolidation and close calculations that anyone can build. With that, we'll get started.
Okay, hello. Just a little bit about ArganoInterRel. I think the key thing here is our mission, which is to leave the world a smarter place than we found it. So at ArganoInterRel, we really like to learn things. It's one of our top strengths, and we love to pass on what we learn. So we like to give our knowledge away to our clients, to anyone who wants to listen, really. We like we're excited about teaching what we know. Oops. Whoops, sorry. We're sharing the screen and sometimes we fight for control. Anyway, a little bit more about us. We are recognized experts. We have a lot of Oracle ACE directors and ACEs and associates and alumni. We've written best-selling books on different EPM topics and BI topics, Essbase and planning and cloud. And we are award-winning partners with Oracle and Time, 5,000 fastest growing companies. We offer a full service array of products and services. And we have 150 EPM cloud specializations within our company, and it's growing every day. It's something that we think it's important enough that anyone coming into the company, no matter what area of the company that they are working in, we require these cloud specializations. So it's just one thing. It's another way that we show that we love learning and we love passing on what we learn. And I'm going to let Terrance talk about that other recognized statistic there.
The Net Promoter Score is a measure of how likely a customer is to recommend a brand, a product, or a service to a friend or to a colleague. The industry average for systems integrators is 24. And for global systems integrators, the average is 9. At ArganoInterRel, our Net Promoter Score is 77, which is indicative of our client satisfaction and the relationships that we form with our clients. World class, yes, world class, is simply our expectation, and every day we hold ourselves to this standard of excellence. It's our commitment to excellence that distinguishes us from our competition. We're committed to building digital foundations that improve operating efficiency, agility, and effectiveness to not only propel our customers, but to enable them to become industry leaders. We are ArganoInterRel. With that, we'll jump into our fun session today, but we'll have a brief introduction to financial consolidation and close for those who are slightly unaware, we'll say. What is FCC? FCC is Oracle's purpose-built software as a service application, or business process, better yet, that is built to address the financial consolidations process. What is it? It is the industry leader from a little out-of-the-box functionality perspective to perform consolidations. It underlies the literal commonality, I guess we'll say, across the Oracle Cloud EPM stack, given that it is an application that is based upon Essbase. So from a commonality perspective, all of the Oracle Cloud EPM business processes that are consolidations planning centric leverage Essbase as an underlying engine. It is both a configurable and a customizable application with pre-built definitions for hierarchies and calculations. And for those who are concerned, there's literally limited to no investment required for maintaining FCC from an infrastructure perspective. As far as the application's dimensionality, Fairly straightforward. The application comes with, by default, depending on application enablement, 11 to 12 application dimensions. We'll speak to a few just to make certain we're clear as far as how do we achieve these calculation of consolidation efficiencies. In the application, for those who may have attended Rich Wilkie's presentation a few moments ago, the application has evolved over time. And over the last few months, we've actually noticed some great efficiencies as far as being able to pivot a few of our application dimensions from being sparse to dimension to dense. And I'll speak to that in an upcoming session as well. So please hang around. That said, from a customizable perspective, we can enable certain application features for currencies. We're finding that from an implementation perspective, we are literally implementing multi-currency and intercompany in almost all of our application implementation. Another application feature enablement is the multi-gap dimension, which is probably implemented closer to 40 to 50% of our implementations. Definitely usable for having different levels of reporting for local GAAP, maybe IFRS. But again, from a distinctions perspective, the consolidation application dimension is based on how data transforms throughout the consolidations process for our entities. As data is transforming from a valuation perspective from local currency or entity currency to the parent currency. And it also takes into effect some form of elimination activities and also proportionalization as entity values are consolidated up the tree from financial reporting perspective. The movement dimension is a purpose-built dimension that addresses two specific features in the application. One, it actually tracks how data moves, movements dimension, from a valuation perspective. And it also is a means for deploying a indirect statement of cash flows method within the application. And then lastly, the data source dimension is simply a means of segregating differing forms of fashions of data for ease of reference or analytics. Veronica?
Okay. Member formulas. Member formulas are a key way of being able to calculate data in FCC. And as Edward Roski explained to me many years ago when he taught a Essbase class that I took many years anyway, a member formula is, it's basically the way that we can calculate data within a specific formula, a member, an intersection. It allows us to do if statements so that we can have conditions applied to it. It works if you don't have a lot of dependencies, where you could say, if it's this month, then do this calculation. If it's this scenario, do that calculation. But really, if you have dependencies, that's better for the calculation scripts that we'll talk about later. But a member formula gives you some dynamic ways of pulling data out of the system. It takes up less space in your database because it is dynamic, and it can give you information that you need when you retrieve the data. That's kind of how it works. And typically it would be on an account dimension, because as you can see here, this example where we have a ratio, and it's a ratio that is looking at two different two different accounts. And so you would have that calculation there in the account dimension. That's where it's most common. It's not recommended to be put on the movement dimension because it can have performance concerns. So that's something that's an FCC specific. Here are some samples of member formulas. Like I said, you can have if conditions, so that you can say for this beginning balance backlog, if I'm in December of a specific year, do this, otherwise do this. And you can use functions in it. You can use the cross-dimensional operator, so you can pull from an intersection from multiple dimensions when you're retrieving data. So those are some of the samples of what you can do with a member formula. Here's another member formula where our if condition is actually looking at a cross-dimensional intersection. If I'm in a specific month of a specific year, then I'm going to look at the prior, which is a function, or I'm going to look somewhere else. If I'm not, you can use not, you can use is, you can have the functions of at prior, you can add it to other cross-dimensional intersections to build it even more. And you can even have these nested ifs, right? And you can have multiple values based on where you are. And here's examples of EBITDA calculations that you could have, where you could do it simply by adding or subtracting different accounts, or you can do it where you have cross-dimensional operators added to regular intersections, meaning wherever I am in the company dimension, this is what I'm always going to look at, this account for this company, no matter where I am. You can do things like that where you're actually, like if you're looking at an Excel formula where you do F4 and it locks in what you're looking at, you can add that as well to a member formula. And like we were showing before, you could have a ratio where if I wanted to see what my cost is, I can just say, my cost per contract worker, then you can just do cost divided by headcount. And so that's basically how member formulas work.
Next, we'll transition to insertion rules. Now, insertion rules actually is the dawn or of the ability to be able to customize calculations within FCC. There are different fashions for pointing where calculations will exist or occur in the application. We actually leverage the insertion rules of customized calculations in FCC to deliver that specific expectation or output. Within the business or the rules card, there are actually several out-of-the-box calculations that the application comes purpose-built with. We can actually augment this view within the rules card by also including on-demand rules. But for all intents and purposes, insertion point rules are those rules that are included as part of the consolidations and or translations process, such that if an insertion point rule is added to the application, that rule's output will be produced as a valuation each time a consolidation or translation is run. Conversely, if there's a desire to develop on-demand rules, which Veronica will speak to in the coming moments, those particular rule types can be run at on-demand or as required or desired. To actually access the actual consolidations or calculation manager functionality in FCC, there are multiple fashions of actually accessing it. From the navigation menu below the application option, there's consolidations card for accessing the calculation manager, or from the home page from within the application cluster, we can actually access consolidations via the consolidation card. Once you've actually accessed the calculation manager within FCC, it's fairly common for those who've used the calculation manager before from a pure usability perspective. Our reality is once we actually access the calculation manager, there are 3 specific rule types that are prevalent for FCC. There are rules that run at local currency, at the entity currency for actual data valuations. We can also point or craft calculations that are to be produced on a translated basis. And then third, we can actually produce consolidation rules that are effective post-translation. We can actually affect eliminations or have some differing fashion for performing some form of translation or calculation in the application. Within the actual rule sets in the application, there are really 7 specific rules that we have. There are 2 for local currency, there are 3 for translated, and there are also 2 for the consolidations premise. And again, the actual definitions for the actual calculations are very true to the defined rule grouping definitions. First, we'll speak to local currency. When we're speaking of local currency, again, we can actually access the local currency rule groups from the actual tab that's associated with local currency, those being for calculations that are to be performed before the balance carry forward or final calculations. Again, these are the 10 and 20 rules for deployment within FCC. Then secondarily, there is the translated rule group. Again, these rules are true, as I mentioned earlier, to the actual translations process. Our data valuations at the parent currency level of the currency dimension from a little currency replication perspective for financial reporting. Just as was the case for local currency, we can produce calculations that are performed before FX is invoked, as well as after FX, as well as we can produce some form of translation logic on a final basis after the actual balance carry forward has been performed. And as I mentioned earlier, there are three specific rules that are true to the translations process. Those again being the 25, 30, and 40 rules themselves. And then lastly, the consolidated rule group. Again, this is no more than our fashion of being able to unpack post-translated data in the application. We've got the wherewithal and from a consolidated perspective to actually produce configurable consolidations to impact data at the elimination level of the consolidation dimension, as well as being able to produce scripted logic after the balance carry forward and as final calculations. And again, those last two are included within the 50 and 60 rules for FCC. Now, as far as some sample custom rules that we'll speak to in the coming moments, we'll speak to a couple of points for reference in this particular example. One of the more pervasive areas of feature functionality that we found as FCC's involved over the years has been the little advent of creating a dang block. Now, for those who transitioned from HFM, there was no literal premise of what the heck is a block. But from an Essbase perspective, there is a requirement that there be some level of content or dirtying, to use Veronica's vernacular, so that we can produce a value as a result of a calculation. Now, because we are limited on time and you have two talkers presenting today, we won't. Okay, I'm sorry for including you in that too. Because you have two people who love to pass on information, better yet, that might be softer. We won't be able to go in great depth like we'd like to as far as the block creation process today. But in an upcoming session, we'll speak to our phantasmal ways of creating blocks. But our reality is that's actually changed over the last few months, given that as of the 2108 or the August release of FCC, we have the wherewithal now to actually pivot which dimensions in the application are dense. Prior to 2108, the account dimension was the single or singular dense dimension in the application. As a result of the make period and movement dense feature deployment in August, we can now deploy applications with two dense dimensions, with account not being one of those. So from that perspective, some of our fashions for creating blocks will have to pivot because in many cases we leverage the moving dimension as our dimension for block creation. Well, now, given that account is now a sparse dimension, we can actually define that as our mode for creating blocks. But again, the premise for creating blocks isn't all that complicated. It's just a matter of being true from a leading practice perspective in rule development or rule deployment. Also, I get questions all the time as far as for those who are still, yes, unfortunately, still using HFM for the consolidations. How difficult is it to transition calculations from HFM to FCC? That's a fairly lengthy conversation. I talk too dang much, but I'll see if I can be very concise. That transition isn't very complicated because, one, in many and or most cases, a number of the calculations that were created in HFM are now out of the box, so that level of transition is no longer required. But for true customized definitions in FCC that are not out of the box, that transition, which Veronica will speak to in the coming moments, for fixing and infixing and ifing and if-ifing, I keep getting it confused, is something that's fairly straightforward from a little syntactical perspective. That isn't a huge transition, but when Veronica speaks to cross-dim operators, it's no different than the dot or the decimal that we use in HFM for VB. Same premise, different premise from a syntax perspective, but for all intents and purposes, it's fairly straightforward. But our reality is, from a customized calculation perspective, there are as many, yes, I did say as many, functions that are available to us from an Essbase perspective, not all, but many, that we can leverage for custom calculations in FCC that I think will make that transition much more expeditious. Now, reality also is that from within FCC's calculation manager, we have a very similar premise, if not the exact same, when it comes to rule deployment, in that there is a validations process The good win for us is, and I say the good win is because there's a little bit better from my perspective, error tracking or error notifications when there are concerns or issues with business rules or calculations in FCC. So the means or the operation for addressing or resolving some of those issues is much more readily available, visual in the logging in FCC than it would have been in HFM. Again, from a calculation perspective, we have same notification definitions in FCC as far as the actual impacts when rules are deployed, so that will be a commonality from a transitional perspective. Now, we talked to actual scripting definitions again. We can have as phantasmal as we want rule definitions or very, very simplified calculations that Veronica spoke to when it comes to member formulas. You note that we can fix on differing fashions of content, we'll say, in FCC, given that we can fix on different members, member properties. There are different calc mode options that we have, top down, bottom up. We also have some really cool functions for being able to point to specific members forward or specific members back from our siblings or our L siblings perspective. We can also specifically speak to certain relative definitions for corresponding members, would that be level 0, what have you. We can also leverage the block creation that I spoke to earlier that we're going to definitely give you more depth on in the coming days or months. And also from a little calculation perspective, it's fairly true to what we've seen historically. Now, the one thing that Veronica will speak to also is there are certain members, as was the case or is the case in HFM, that we cannot leverage as being part of the left side of the equation. There are also, from a right side perspective, we have an open platform for actually being able to leverage almost all dimensional references of members on the right side of our equation, but the left side, there are certain limitations, which also existed with HFM as well. Again, we want to make certain that we also note that the commentary or commenting out is a little bit different within FCC than it would have been in HFM. Again, but our reality is from the calculation manager ribbon, there are certain shortcuts that we can use to highlight syntax or text, and we can comment out blocks of text in one fell swoop. Veronica?
Okay, I want to, because we're going to go through, fix and end fix and things, but I just want to highlight a couple of things that Terrance was talking about. One is about commenting. And this is a practice that we typically add, and mainly so that we don't get lost. So you notice how he has a lot of ifs and they're nested ifs, and then we have the else if and the end if. Couple of things. One is indenting, and Calc Manager will help you indent, but indenting I think is key so that you know what you're actually working on. Notice this if, else if, and end if is all in the same line. So you know that this is one block of code. This if ends here. And I also notice how there's commenting to say what the end if is on. So here I'm looking at accounts. And so when I do the end if, that's telling me I'm stopping my account calculation section, and I'm ifing here. I call it ifing and end ifing, but really you're focusing on specific entities, specific years. So using commenting as a couple of things. One, you can explain what's going on in the calculation. So if someone needs to look at it as well, or sometimes you forget what you did. So having the commenting to tell you why you did it the way you did it. I've had it multiple times where I was coding and it worked. And then someone said, why'd you do this? And I'm like, I don't remember. And so going back to explain why you did it the way you did it, or what you're trying to achieve, and being able to keep track of where you are with your comments, hugely, hugely helpful. Now to go back into the fix and end fix. Fix and end fix, and a little bit later we'll talk about fix parallel and end fix parallel. This is how Essbase manages what you're calculating. So fixing really is, the way I see it is, when I'm cooking in the kitchen and I'm taking everything out of the fridge, I'm fixing on what I'm going to make, and I bring it all out on the counter, and then I I cook with it. So with the fix and end fix, you don't want everything in the fridge. You only want certain things. You might not want everything in the pantry. You only want certain things. That's what the fix and end fix does. It helps you to create the area that you're working in, and then you do things within the fix and the end fix. And if you have a fix statement, it's important to have your end fix statement. You'll get an error when you try to validate. It's also important to understand that everything between the fix and the end fix happens as if it's a block of data. I've also had it happen before where I was getting unexpected results, and I had to do an end fix and close the block and open it back up with the exact same fix of all the same dimensionality again in order to get the next answers to be what I expected them to be. So if you think of it as everything within your fix and your end fix is a block of data calculating, sometimes you have to close that block and open it again to do something else, even though it's the same thing and logically you don't think you have to, but to get the results you want, you have to sometimes close that block. And any dimension not listed in your fixed statement, it will calculate on all the members in that dimension. So you really want to be as explicit in your fixed statement as you can be, so that you don't have to calculate on members that it doesn't make sense to calculate on. Especially if you're using things to create blocks, you might create too many blocks because you haven't restricted what you're fixing on. Within FCC, sorry, that's an old slide where it had the S. Within FCC, there are some dimensions that you can't fix on because FCC does it automatically for the consolidation process. And as Terrance said, they can't be, members from these dimensions can't be on the left side of your equal sign. They can't be on the left. They can be on the right because you can use any dimension when you're trying to calculate what the answer is, but they can't be on the left. And those are the scenario, year, period, view, and entity dimensions. You can't fix on them because FCC already does. And there are also certain members that are out of the box that you can't fix on the members themselves. And there's a function in Essbase that's an @remove, so that you can fix on everything but what you want to remove, which are those out of the box FCC members that you're not allowed to fix on. And here's an example of a fixed statement where I'm fixing on region, and then I fix on actual, and I calculate this would be a member that has a member formula. That's the little tricky thing. Or it aggregates because it's calculating this, it's aggregating or running the formula. And then I'm going to end fix on actual, I'm going to fix on budget, and then I'm going to calculate something else. So this is a nested fix statement where you have your big fix and then your little fixes where I'm only going to do this one member for actual and this one for budget. And that's how those work. A warning in doing that though, when you do nested fix statements, it's cumulative. So if you fix on actual and then later on you fix on budget without end fixing on actual, you will then calculate actual and budget. So it's cumulative. And once again, that's why commenting is so helpful, because if you had a large calculation and you fixed on another scenario or another account further down, you wouldn't know until your results were unexpected. So that's just something to think about, is that when you are fixing, it's cumulative. If statements are our condition statements. And this is where I can look to see, like if I wanted to fix on certain accounts and I wanted to do different things for different accounts, then I can say, if the account is this, then do this. If the account is this, do something else. So this is the way that we can have conditions. And typically what we say, and to Terrance's point, the fact that we now can have two dense dimensions and it doesn't even have to be a count. We fix on sparse dimensions because it tells the index what you want to work on. And to Terrance's point about block creation, and if there's a block there that's it's indicated in the index, and when we fix on those dimensions, it brings it in. If I do an if statement, if I if on a dense member, it's faster. So before we could only, we would typically if on the account dimension. With FCC, because that was the only dimension and we were using other methods to create blocks, we would fix on a sparse member. I mean, if on a sparse member, it's just it kind of throws our common knowledge out the window. But the idea is that you can if on a member, and sometimes it will slow it down. The other thing to know about if statements, and then I'll hurry up. The other thing to know about if statements is you have to be in a member block, and the member block is what Terrance had in his sample of his script, where he had the movement member, or not the movement. What was the member you? Anyway, you fixed on a block and you use that to create other blocks. You have to have your if conditions. You can't have an if condition to the left of an equal sign. It has to be within a calc block because it treats it as if it's a member formula. Having it be that calc block treats it like it's a member formula where you can have your if conditions.
Configurable calculations. Now, our reality is because, by definition, FCC is a configurable application. Oracle blessed us with a number of different opportunities to be able to simply configure calculations that they define already or prior. In this case, when we're talking about some configurable calculations, in this case we're actually referring to a translation override, we can actually leverage the simple configurable definitions to define differing driver definitions that will give us our desired result. In this particular example, we are literally overriding the standard translations process to reduce a value to give us valuations based on leveraging the prior year's FX rates. And in doing so, you'll note that we're simply leveraging and defining specific defaults or managing default definitions in the application, and then using those defaults to better yet define our definitions for these configurable calculations. In this case, as I mentioned earlier, we're simply saying that we want to define from our redirection perspective, we want to define the corresponding accounts that we want to leverage. In FCC, in the lower section of this actual view, we're actually redirecting on the levels or descendants of retained earnings current, which is where within the FCC the income statement member definitions from a hierarchical perspective exist. So we're simply defining this particular action to occur for our income statement accounts. And we're simply saying, as opposed to using the average rate for the current year and our actual scenario, we actually want to simply point to the actual scenario, but the prior year variable to get the FX rates from that period versus saying, I'm in 2021, I want to actually point to the rates in 2020. I'm leveraging the prior year variable to point to that specific FX rate content, and I'm also using the variable for the current period, which prevents me from having to have any form of redundant calculation definitions that are defined by specific member references. From that perspective, we can actually develop a translation override logic that is very, very straightforward and simple, and very straightforward in communicating how we can have a different scenario to be able to produce a different valuation based on the same content that might exist in a different scenario, but we're simply leveraging different FX rates for comparative reporting or analytics purposes themselves.
Okay, on-demand rules. Oops. On-demand rules they're used to be able to run rules that are outside of the consolidation process. They can speed up your consolidation process because you don't have to run them every time you consolidate by definition. So it would be really good for like an allocation rule. And when Terrance showed screenshots of Calc Manager, we had a couple of samples of an allocation rule. So being able to have these on-demand rules is really going to help speed up your consolidations and give you more flexibility of what FCC can do for you. It can also be added to forms that you input so that you can run a rule on save of a form, and you can launch it from Smart View as a calculate. So it gives more flexibility to the users and expands what FCC can do. Once again, our fix statement. So what happens with on-demand rules is it by default creates 6 fixed parallel commands, and it forces you to choose a single member of these 6 dimensions. And it shows up as a runtime prompt so that when you run the rule, you can either set it to, always run the same as an override within your formula, within your calc script, or you can have the user input what the members are when they go to run it. You can have it pull off of a form. So that's the great thing about having it on a form, is that if I'm only doing 1 month at a time, I can pull that month into my rule because I can set it to pull in the form data into the business rule. So these are the dimensions that come out of the box. You have to select. You can't use the intercompany eliminations for the on-demand rules, but you can use these other dimensions. And there are some specific consolidation accounts that you have to use. If you wanted to use the override, you have to set a variable first so that it knows to use the override within your on-demand rule. And here's an example of how in Calc Manager, you can have an on-demand rule. And you notice here, there's an option of calc script or Groovy script now, because Groovy got introduced, and we'll talk about that next. But this is just a rule that here are your runtime prompts that you have to select. These are the 6 fixed parallels that are hidden in the back that you can't see. And notice here where I have it saying that it's hidden, and I'm going to pass this value instead, and the other ones are open. That means it can pull from the form, or the user can enter it, but you have the option of overriding what the value is and always adding the specific value that you want. And then you can just treat it like a business rule where you do certain things. And in this instance, we're just clearing out data. And within on-demand rules, as Terrance was saying, you can run them, you can launch them from the business rules area by clicking here. You can launch them from Smart View. You can launch them from a save on a form. And when you go to launch, here's where the variables, so in that other form, in this rule, these 2 variables were hidden and already selected. So when you launch it, you don't have to select those 2 dimensions, they're hidden. So then as a user, you only have to select these, because once again, you ran it from outside of a form. Now Groovy, it's Groovy because it's disco. No, Groovy was introduced in 2105. It provides even more flexibility for the on-demand rules. It can do things like if you have it on a form, before you even submit the data, Groovy will do a validation to make sure the data you entered is within a certain range, or it, you can validate your data, and it prevents you from saving data if the validation fails. So the user actually has to update their data and then save. The other thing that you can do is, once again, from a form, you can have a dynamically created fixed statement so that it only has a fixed statement of what is on the form. It's faster because it's not calculating everything, only what's on the form, only what was edited on a form. There are those kinds of methods in Groovy as well. You can also use it to launch REST API calls. And you can use it for in-memory grid calculations, like if you wanted to do certain types of currency conversions, or if you needed to be able to calculate something. A cool thing, you can use it for block creation, because Groovy doesn't follow the same Essbase BSO rules for block creation. And we've had it where Now, granted, this was a planning application. We took a block from someplace, multiplied it by data from a block that there was no correlation to create data in a third block. So Groovy really does expand what we can do. There's a lot of really good documentation on it, specific to if I want to use it to call the REST API to do other things like call data management rules or other business rules. There's the Groovy docs documentation that Oracle provides. And as they add more features to the Oracle Groovy, they update this document constantly. They have examples of what the Groovy code would look like if you were really using it. So I really highly recommend using the documentation as well. And here's an example. So one of the things is now that we can integrate FCC with planning, and a lot of our planning implementations use FCC as the source of actual data. And there's coordination as to when the data pushes, but now we can, using Groovy, I can call a data management rule from planning that pulls data from FCC. And in this rule, a little preview, you have to create a connection between FCC and your planning application so that you can then talk to the planning application. But this code is how you would set it up so that you monitor the data management rule to make sure that it succeeds before the next step happens. Then we can use variables so that we can pass the year and period for the data management rule, and then we can run the data management rule. And this section of code is actually where you're running the rule. We are here determining what my start and end dates are, and then I can use it to just call my data management rule. So in essence, your FCC application is telling your planning application, okay, you're going to get data now. And this is the same thing with another rule that runs once that data has been loaded. So like I said, it checks the status to make sure that the data management is all done before it does something else. And then here I can run a business rule that's going to calculate my actuals in planning. All of this can be run from FCC. So that's just one example of how Groovy can use REST API to call things and to run things in different environments. And that's above and beyond, like we said, how we can use it for in-memory calculations and validations and dynamic fixing and things like that.
Groovy, I cannot believe this.
We did it.
I had no dream that we could finish in under 45
We
minutes.
did
We have
it.
time for Q&A, but high five, Ronnie. Pow. Okay. In summary, when we speak to FCC in the advent of customizing the application with calculations, there are certain thought processes that have to be effected to allow this to be a true realization. The first we speak to is the literal dimensional definitions. Dimensional design and having efficient dimensional definitions is very, very key in realizing, one, the ability to be able to produce efficient calculations as well as being able to produce optimal calculations with desirable run times. Also, to Veronica's point, there are a number of ways of calculating data in FCC. We spoke to three today. We spoke to insertion point rules or customized calculations. We spoke to on-demand rules. We also spoke to member formulas. There's also the advent of leveraging the out-of-the-box configurable calculations as well, which are more driver-based, if nothing else, within the application given their pre-built definitions. Our reality is that when we're talking about leveraging leading practice in developing insertion point rules, we want to make certain that those rules are as focused as they can be to produce optimal calculation times that also have a direct impact on consolidations. Our reality also is that there isn't always a need to calculate, because our reality is there are so many out-of-the-box calculations in FCC that you may not believe this, but I think that maybe one of the resources on my team is on the call. We've actually implemented FCC sit back, Veronica, sit back. We've implemented FCC a number of times with literally no custom calculations. Now, I can actually add to that We've actually created some applications that actually even don't even have member formula calculations. We're simply leveraging the out-of-the-box feature functionality definitions to keep the application as simple as possible. Because again, from an application ownership perspective, customizations can be costly down the line. So we want to make sure we're very, very mindful of that in our application design. And then to wrap up, as Veronica mentioned, with the little advent of Groovy and the opportunities that we have in deploying Groovy scripting in FCC, it's limited. It's literally limitless as far as our options for being able to define differing fashions of calculations, and also to Veronica's point, being able to interact with other applications, leveraging Groovy with other conduit applications like the REST API. With that, I think that we may have a couple questions in our Q&A. Oh, there's something in chat as well. Let's see if we can pull up. Oh, gotcha. Thank you, Glenn. Then from a Q&A perspective, let's see. Does FCC support the data export to the inbox trick that PBC has, aka blah, 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 as part of the data export file command? Veronica, you want to take that one?
I'm going to be honest and say I will find out for you, because I know that there's a list of functions that FCC can't run like PBCS can. I will look to see if data export is one of those.
Okay. Okay. So we'll follow up on that question. We'll make certain that, oh, unfortunately, we don't know who the question was posed from, but we'll see if we can get that answer posted with our marketing group. We are literally at our time. Are there any other questions that we should populate in this session, or respond to in this session, Betty, excuse me, before we wrap up for the day? I'll give you a few moments. Since we've received none, it seems like a number were answered prior. I again am Terrance Walker, here with the incomparable Veronica running it for you. Really excited to present in our Solutions 21 conference customized FCC calculations that anyone can build. We want to thank you guys for attending and wish you guys an absolutely grand day. And please hang around for the other sessions that are part of our